I've met most of you, but for those I haven't met, I'm Cori Ellison. I'm the dramaturg at the Glyndebourne Opera. And I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in this presentation. As I've mentioned, for an opera house dramaturg, the issue of scores and additions is a leitmotif, shall we say. I'm even more delighted to be given the honor of introducing Philip Gossett. I've had the pleasure of working with him on 3 Rossini operas at New York City Opera, and also consulting him on innumerable other projects. Introducing Philip is easy because, as the saying goes, he needs no introduction. But it's difficult also because it's really impossible to adequately sum up his career in the time that we have. To quote his honors would take all day, and his publications would take another day. So I'm just going to mention a couple of highlights. Of course, at the University of Chicago, he's the Robert W. Renneker Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus. He also served there as the Dean of Humanities. And he also is the general editor of the critical editions of the complete works of Verdi and of Rossini. And I think he'd probably like me to say that he is a Cavaliere di Gran Croce, which is the Italian government's highest civilian honor. Philip retired in 2010, but I'm not sure he knows that. Because he's still going strong, as you will see today, and I think he's a paragon of among musicologists in his active relationship with performing organizations, getting down and getting his hands dirty, working with singers and conductors and opera companies and dramaturgs, and his impact on performance has been just immeasurable. His impact on a whole body of works being available, and I will just say there's probably no greater honor than to say that his book Divas and Scholars, which deals with that aspect of his work, that divas actually read it. So, without further ado, Philip Gossett.
Musical examples over here so I can get them when I need them. We have been publishing the Verdi Critical Edition since 1983. Indeed, we have actually published 16 volumes of the edition. Others are on the way. You would think that opera houses would be clamoring to use the new materials, with scores produced by the University of Chicago Press and the performing materials by G. Ricordi of Milan, which are state-of-the-art in their quality. But they're certainly not doing any such thing, at least not in the United States. Perhaps we've been overly concerned about getting the scores right and not concerned enough with the work that needs to be done to convince performers that they should be performing from the best texts available and not from reprints of 19th century, heavily censored materials. But we have not succeeded, by and large, in turning the attention of contemporaries from the cheapest possible scores. Better to spend a little more money on gold paint for a stage set, immediately visible to a vast public, than on the music being performed. That an opera company might need to pay something to get a better score in a country that has few laws for the protection of critical editions, indeed in which copyright legislation is intended more to protect Mickey Mouse from the hard work of scholars is simply not acceptable to me. I have yet to be told by anyone, perhaps today will be different, that our scores are in any way of poor quality, but the quality does not seem to be enough. I have had some wonderful experience working with these new scores, many of them as exciting as a scholar could hope to have. In some cases, this work has brought us directly into collaborations with some of the finest musicians in the world. I have just had the great pleasure of hearing two performances of David Lawton's edition of Verdi's Macbeth, conducted by Riccardo Muti with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and Chorus, featuring as Macbeth and Lady two great singers, Luca Salsi and Tatiana Seryan. It was a particular pleasure to know that our edition was being used so scrupulously. It is not the first time that Muti has been our close friend. He conducted the first performance of our edition of Verdi's Rigoletto in 1983. But in Vienna, a location that seems to have little interest in our work, I was astonished when Mima Guastoni, then head of Ricordi, told me that the Viennese had refused to rent from Ricordi our edition of Rossini's Il Viaggio a Reims, a piece that did not exist before we undertook scholarly work on the score. So in order to keep her close ties to Claudio Abbado, who wants to conduct the opera in Vienna, she had to make it available to them for nothing. Nor is it the first time that I've heard Muti's take on Macbeth, but at the Rome Opera, where I saw the opera staged in 2012, he was forced to compromise with the needs of the stage director and his wonderful Macbeth. Clearly, the conductor wanted to perform, as he did with the CSO, the 1865 revision of the opera, written in Italian for Paris. Not that the French heard the opera in the form Verdi wrote it in 1865. We know for certain, because we have a score that presumably preserves the opera in the way it was performed that year in Paris. In it, for instance, Lady does not sing both strophes for Brindisi in the Act 2 finale. The second strophe is sung by Macduff. But Verdi was adamant that this could not be. They had tried to convince him that the tenor, Macduff, should have a more prominent role. As far as he was concerned, there were only three real characters in the opera: Macbeth, Lady, and the witches. And no matter what you did with Macduff, it would be a marginal part. In any case, it made no dramatic sense for him to sing the Brindisi, which had a dramatic point only when intoned by Lady, both times. Likewise, in the print that was issued of the opera in Paris, the score was published in French translation, as presumably it was performed. But we know for certain that Verdi did his modifications in Italian, not in French. But in Rome, the stage director wanted the chorus of aerial spirits in Act 3, danced by children who could not perform the ballet Verdi had written for Paris. And so Muti chose to begin the third act of the opera with that ballet before the witches' chorus, rather than to follow the chorus with the ballet, as Verdi intended in the final. And in the final act, he was compelled to close the opera with the Morte di Macbetto, a lovely piece to be sure, and one Verdi very much appreciated in 1847, but one he decided not to include for Paris, since he knew the critics would consider it to be old-fashioned. It was not unlike the Morte di Abigaile in his Nabucco, another final death scene that was not well regarded after the 1840s. Yet there are few baritones who do not want to take the opportunity to sing this death scene, and that was the case also in Rome. With the CSO, however, Muti could do the entire 1865 score as Verdi conceived it, with the ballet in its proper place and a final hymn taking the place of the death scene for our anti-hero. Muti was also very helpful when we prepared for publication Helen Greenwald's excellent edition of Verdi's Attila. It is an opera the Italian conductor very much loves, and when he had an opportunity to make his debut at the Metropolitan Opera, he chose to present Attila, and he did so using a preliminary version of the new critical edition. I did not love the production the Met did of the opera, but Muti could not complain too much, since costumes and stage set were prepared by a team of Italians. But after he had had direct experience with Greenwald's score of the work in the Opera House, he sat with her for several hours and went over point by point in the edition where he had had various problems, or where he would have interpreted the evidence in a different manner. And I know that Miss Greenwald was very grateful to him for the attention he had paid to her work. She could not accept everything he felt he needed to do, a crescendo that came from the conductor's instincts, but for which there was no evidence whatsoever in authentic documents, could not be adopted by the edition, even if it made sense to the maestro. We had no quarrel whatsoever with his decisions, which musically always made good sense. But remember that a critical edition, indeed any edition of a musical score, seeks to provide a printed version of the music. It does not pretend to give every piece of information that a performer might want today. A worthy critical edition makes available whatever information we can find about the form a printed score should take, but it does not pretend to provide more than that. Ultimately, that is what makes the work with performers so exciting. We know, as did composers in the 19th century, that a printed edition cannot pretend to take the place of performers. It is ultimately the performers who must decide how to interpret the signs they see before themselves when they prepare a score for performance. But we try as hard as we can to present the best possible written text of an opera. Then it is up to the performers to transform that written text into a performance of the work. If the composer returned to an opera on more than one occasion, we provide all information possible. In the case of Attila, that meant providing 2 additional romances for Forresto to sing at the beginning of the last act, a version Verdi prepared for Napoleone Moriani, whose autograph is found at the Teatro alla Scala, where Moriani first sang his romance in December 1846, and another Verdi prepared for Rossini's protege, the Russian tenor who had come first to Milan in 1830 together with Mikhail Glinka, known in Italy as Nikolai Ivanov, which Ivanov first sang in a revival of the opera in Trieste during the fall of 1846. Its autograph is, unexpectedly, in the Library of Congress. Also in the Library of Congress is part of the autograph manuscript of the 1865 revision of Macbeth, a section of the second act finale that Verdi, by mistake, did not include with his original materials he sent to Paris for that performance. Part of our job, of course, is finding where possible all the authentic material pertaining to any given title. We're not always successful in this, and there are people who are sometimes willing to be cooperative and others who refuse to cooperate. Currently, Carlita Stefan, who has recently done similar work for Bellini, is preparing a critical edition of all the songs of Verdi. We know for certain that Verdi prepared 2 songs for which we have only incomplete material available. They were written on the same days in which he composed other songs. In one case, E la vita un mar d'Afani, a song Verdi gave to someone in Rome on the 5th of November 1844, an auction house, Stargard of Berlin, published 1 page of 2, 11 of 13 measures. So we don't have very much to guess at, and we can publish the piece without too much difficulty, and with a good hope that we can be relatively accurate. This original manuscript, the auction house tells me, was bought by Albie Rosenthal, surely acting for one of his clients. But Mr. Rosenthal is now dead, and we cannot trace the manuscript further. In the other case, an auction house, also Stargard, sold the manuscript, which is dated 6 May 1842, the same date Verdi wrote another song, based on a Goethe text, Erste Verlust, in an auction on 29 June 2005. They published in facsimile 1 page of 3, and we simply cannot guess what the composer might have done for the remainder of the piece. I cannot blame Stargard in any way for protecting the desires of its customers, but they have been very willing to send our queries on to the present-day owners, who must decide personally whether they will help us or not. The original manuscript that Verdi wrote on 6 May 1842 was purchased by an English collector who has been willing thus far to give us the entire text, O potessi ritornar, hoping that we could identify this text, which thus far we've been unable to do, but has been unwilling to share the music with us. So in Carlita's edition, we must present the piece for now, only as a fragment. Most difficult is our relationship with the Carrara-Verdi family at Sant'Agata. That they possess an enormous collection of Verdi material is clear. They have worked closely with the AIVS for the letters and other documentary material in their possession, but not for the music we know they own. While the one-time patriarch of the family, Alberto Carrara-Verdi, was alive, they shared much with us. We have, for example, some 400 pages of previously unknown autographed material related to La Forza del Destino. But since his death several years ago, possession of the musical manuscript has passed to 4 siblings who must agree before they can share anything with us or with anyone else. And Italian laws make it very difficult for them to sell the materials they possess, since they are not permitted to move any of it out of Italy, which means that they cannot go to major auction houses like Sotheby's in London, for example, to capitalize on the musical material they own. They have not been very cooperative in recent years, but it is not because of the Verdi edition alone that they seem unwilling to be cooperative. When the mother of the 4 siblings died a year and a half ago, the Gazzetta di Parma printed 2 announcements for a funeral, one for a Wednesday, one for a Thursday, to suit the needs of a sibling who lived in Berkeley at the time. We thought it odd that they would bury her, dig her up again, and bury her anew. But this proved unnecessary. I gather that the sibling from California at that time, arrived on the Wednesday at Malpensa in Milan and took a taxi to Sant'Agata so she could be present for some of the Wednesday funeral service. And so the Thursday event was canceled. As you can imagine, this dance earned the family the scorn of most of Italy, but they didn't care a hoot, and they've been unwilling recently to share anything else with us, which is why we have not yet been able to publish the late works of Verdi. We know that the family owns important sources for Simon Boccanegra, Otello, and Falstaff, not to mention for Aida. The materials they own include the overture Verdi prepared for Milan in 1872, hoping to duplicate the successes of his Forza del Destino overture of 1869, a later revision of the prelude he prepared for St. Petersburg in 1862, without which we did not want to undertake a publication of these works. And it is principally for that reason that right now we are filling in earlier works for which we do have reasonably complete materials. I Due Foscari, edited by Andreas Giger, is next in the series. It will be followed by Francesco Izzo's Un Giorno di Regno, after which we hope finally to publish not only David Lawton's Le Trouvère in French, but also my edition of La Forza del Destino. Earlier, some manuscripts, including the first page of sketches for Falstaff, which fortunately were bought by the Banca Intesa of Milan and is hence available to scholars, were given away by members of the family who had access to this material, but this does not seem to be happening anymore. Some sketches for Otello had early been given to Gatti Casa. At the time, he was the head of the Metropolitan Opera. But when Linda Fairtile found in the Toscanini Memorial Archives a copy of this manuscript that Gatti Casa had given to Toscanini, the then owner of the manuscript, whoever that may be, turns it over to the Sotheby's in London to be sold, which it has since been. And he prevented Linda from publishing all the transcriptions that she had hoped to bring out in the pages of 19th century music. Still, we have come a long way in making music available that previously had not been available. One of our great triumphs was the reconstruction of Verdi's opera Stephelio, which had its premiere in the new edition at the Metropolitan Opera of New York with Placido Domingo in the title role. To undertake this reconstruction, we had to understand first that a great part of the original autograph exists still today at Casa Ricordi archives in Milan, where the pages were afterwards reused in the opera that Verdi derived from Stephelio in 1856 known as Araldo, after he became convinced that the religious censors in Italy would not allow the original to circulate further as he had conceived the opera. Then the Carrara-Verdi family kindly allowed us to have access to the material in their possession for both these operas, which included most of the original pages of the 1850 autograph manuscript, which Verdi had removed in 1856 when he redid the opera, the score, to a different libretto. And so we could reconstruct this important opera, falling as it does between Louisa Miller of 1849 and the famous trilogy, which began with Rigoletto in 1850-51. It is important to realize that Verdi's motives for revising his operas later in his life were not always motives with which we necessarily agree. Although the Verdi edition is compelled to print all the music the composer prepared for these operas, we know that Stefalio is a far better work than Araldo, although the composer wrote some very beautiful new music in 1856, just as we know that some of the changes he made for Milan in 1869 and La Forza del Destino make very good musical and dramaturgical sense, while others are not really as convincing. We know from a wonderful article published by John Nadash in the Verdi Forum that the public and the critics, almost from the beginning, objected to the number of dead bodies that filled the stage in the original Forza, and so Verdi rewrote the final scene in 1869 to eliminate this problem. But he also made other adjustments, some of them clear improvements. One would not want to return to Leonora's remarks of 1862 in the first act, which was significantly changed for 1869. But do we really insist that the third act of the opera conclude with Preziosilla's Rataplan? In every performance today, one understands well that in 1869, concluding Act 3 with another aria for Don Alvaro, with the act concluding on the tenor's high C, might have seemed old-fashioned to the contemporary critics. It smacks too much of the conclusion of Act 3 of Il Trovatore, even if Verdi himself did not supply the high C that most tenors insist on singing there. Yet to move the Rataplan with its surefire audience happiness meant moving the entire accompagnamento scene, which is the scene in the military camp, which on musical grounds must accompany it, the scene in the military camp in Italy. It originally came between Don Carlos's aria, in which he delights that the person he now realizes, Don Alvaro, will survive so he can kill him, and the duet in which the two face one another and ultimately fight the duel in which Don Alvaro assumes wrongly that he has killed Don Carlo. He will not learn that Don Carlo has survived until the final act. In Verdi's original opera, the accompagnamento scene, which takes a good half an hour to perform, has a specific dramaturgical function in providing distance between the Don Carlos aria and the duet. Moving it to the end of the act means that there is no psychological distance between the two moments. Thus, by avoiding the old-fashioned aria ending for the act, Verdi actually weakens his opera considerably. Are we compelled to do that today? I don't think so. But the decision rightly rests with performers, not with scholars. We can have all the opinions we want to have, but ultimately it's up to the performers to decide what will earn them the applause or the brickbats from the public. An analogous problem exists in the critical edition of La Traviata. We know that Verdi incorporated two romanze alla française for violette in this opera, pieces in multiple strophes, a form he used rarely for non-French characters, one for each of her slow solos, the first in the primo tempo of her aria that concludes Act 1, A forse lui, the second for the piece that begins the last act, Addio al passato. While it is true that Piave did not sufficiently differentiate the two strophes in Act 1, no such problem exists in Act 3. This is a place where the old Ricordi score and the critical edition are identical. It was a host of singers who decided it was more important to sing high notes, sure audience pleasers, that Verdi didn't write than to follow his instructions about singing two strophes of these pieces, until Nathalie Dessay carefully read the text of Addio al passato, and understood that the two strophes are very different, and so she began singing both strophes, at least of that romance, a practice being followed by many singers today. Imagine if the late Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau had decided not to sing identical strophes of Schubert's songs because he wanted to gussy up other parts of the performances. You want to know what this decision implies. But habits die quickly, and most singers today learn their parts by listening to the recordings of other singers who performed before them in the era of recordings, not from careful study of a written text. One singer who tried her best to sing the role of Violetta, as Verdi wrote it, was Renee Fleming, who was roundly criticized for not performing the part as people were used to hearing it. Damn straight she didn't. She performed it according to Verdi's own markings, not according to other markings that do not stem from the composer in any way. But in one place she refused to follow Verdi's notation, as had a soprano in Parma a few years earlier when we first presented the critical edition. This was in a cadenza at the end of A Forse Lui, where Verdi clearly wrote a cadenza that made use of four front accented groups of 4 notes, followed by 2 notes for the syllable accompanying the final de of Delizia al cor. It went like this. With those 2 notes. But you've never heard it that way, because no one sings it that way anymore. They all sing it. Someone, and I don't know who, decided to perform it as an N-accented group of 4 notes, beginning the final phrase with a single note for the syllable accompanying the final delizia. Now this is a true tradition, a place where singers decide for their own reasons not to follow Verdi's own markings, which are in this case the same in the standard recording score and in the critical edition, but prefer to substitute something else. Passed down from one performer to another, often on recordings, it becomes traditional to sing a passage in a particular fashion, and so you've always heard this cadenza sung as follows. Because no one sings it that way, despite the fact that Verdi clearly wrote it, and it is that way both in the critical edition and in the old recording edition. When it is not, what is not a tradition is singing a mistake in a printed score. So the old recording score of the aria that Manrico sings at the end of his primo tempo, in the great aria that concludes Act 3 of Il Trovatore, follows Verdi's autograph precisely in using as the words for the second presentation of this final section, which occurs twice. In quegli estremi aneliti, la morte a me parà parà, ma solo in ciel precedeti, la morte a me parà. Now this is just a mistake on Verdi's part. I once had the misfortune to hear some 20 singers on a CD of this aria. All of them sang it wrong. The second verse should be, as it is the first time around, in quegli estremi aneliti, a te il pensier verrà, e solo in ciel precedeti, la morte a me parà. In other words, it really should go like this. This is the aria that begins, Ma si ben mio, quel colesare, il tuo ma, la consorte, to be a consorte. And he sings then, fra quelle estrema melody, a te il pensiero verrà, e solo in ciel precedeti, then the wrong thing is etc. No, let's see. I used this example once, and my good friend Will Crutchfield wrote in response that this was just another proof that Verdi's melody was all that really counted. Of course, he was right. But if we can do 1-4-3-4, why not 3-1-2-4 or some other combination of verses? The fact is that Verdi usually got such things right, and there is no reason not to follow his lead or not to correct him when he makes a mistake. There is a similar example in his Rigoletto. Verdi and Piave had originally planned for the entire action of the opera to take place in a single night. But Piave wrote to Verdi complaining that if the Duke's party was not over until dawn, there was no time for Rigoletto to meet Sparafucile that night, for him to sing then an interminable duet with his daughter, for the Duke to appear in Gilda's room to sing a duet with her, for Gilda then to muse on his false name in Caro Nome, and then for the abduction. And so he told Verdi that he, as the librettist, would change the text of the chorus at the beginning of Act 2, the tempo di mezzo in the Duke's aria, so that they are describing activity that took place the evening after the opening party. Yes, responded Verdi, you're absolutely right, and I'll use your verses, but you must also correct Act 1, where the Count of Ceprano asks those who have been insulted by Rigoletto to meet at his house tonight. It's got to be tomorrow. And so Verdi corrected it the first time. But he forgot that he had written the passage for Ceprano twice. So if you look at the old Ricordi score, reprinted by Calmus, you'll see that Ceprano first invites the courtiers to come to his house domani, and then invites them to come stanotte. Well, which is it? It can hardly be both. No, this is just a mistake, not a tradition, and must be corrected, as Martin Chuzik did in the critical edition. No one sings this incorrectly anymore, just as no one will sing una stanza e del vino when Sparafucile asks the Duke what he wants at the beginning of Act 3. He says instead, tua sorella e del vino, as Verdi wrote, not as a censor changed the text to respect the morals of his audience, but as the composer rightly observed in a letter, what would the Duke be doing in an abandoned inn in the outskirts of Mantua if he didn't have an assignation? But opera houses do not feel any compunction about using these obvious corrections from the new edition, even when they do not claim to be using the edition. I recall having listened to a performance on a Saturday broadcast from the Met, where the tenor sang the correct words of Manrico's aria, but of course they weren't officially using our work. Now it could be, although I think it unlikely, that then Manrico just realized there was a mistake here, which he automatically corrected. That is certainly not what happened in Chicago, where a few years back they presented Verdi's Rigoletto in a version that was close indeed to Chuzik's work. I recall having sat in the audience for this performance and having recognized many of the places where they were using the new text. Afterwards, I went backstage to say a word to friends, including the conductor, Jesus Lopez Cobos, who was conducting from Chuzik's score, and to the Duke, Frank Lepardo, an old friend, who congratulated me on the score and told me how much he had enjoyed learning his part from it. But Jesus later admitted to me that the head of the theater, Mr. William Mason, had told him not to say a word about the new edition. He just instructed his librarian to copy out the most important differences into the Calmus parts they already had on hand, so that they would have no need to rent new materials from recording. And so they did. Only in one place did they not use the new text. And I knew this was a mistake on their part as soon as I heard it. The Gilda sang in her duet with her father at the end of the second act, as part of the cadenza, Padre in voi, un angel consolator. Now that is precisely what one finds in the old Ricordi edition of the score. It goes like this. Consolatore. what is printed in every recording score of this opera. But Verdi actually wrote, and the autograph is perfectly clear here, Padre in voi parla, un angel consolator. So that Verdi actually wrote the following. Padre in voi parla, un angel consolator. Like that. That means, of course, that she sings, it makes much better sense. It also means that Gilda sings parla at the same time that her father sings pianto. Te Gil pianto, and she sings Padre in voi parla. But the old recording score just got it wrong. Left out the words, refused the elision of Padre in voi, and misled generations of singers, including the East European soprano who sang Gilda at lyric opera. From my point of view, it was more important that Verdi's wishes got respected than that we collected royalties or rental fees from lyric opera. But I cannot speak for Ricordi or choose it. Did Verdi make a mistake here? Did Ricordi correct this spot for good reason? I cannot imagine what the reason would be. I know at least two places where there is no evidence that he made corrections, but in which the current practice, which in the first case goes back to the very earliest editions of the opera, is certainly an improvement on what the composer has written. In his solo statement of the theme of the quartet in Rigoletto, the Duke is asked to sing this in the autographed manuscript of the opera. Della figlia dell'amore, schiavo son di spezzi tuoi, con un detto sol tu puoi, lei mi pene, like that. That's actually written in the autograph in that way. Now, in fact, there is something truly awful about this poi. And I know no place in the opera where this kind of word division is found. In all the operas, one understands full well why Verdi thought it necessary to do this, because the piece has the previous verses. You heard it just now. Bella figlia dell'amore, schiavo son di spezzi tuoi. So, con un detto sol tu puoi. Like that. But one truly understands why Ricordi, with or without Verdi's permission, we do not know, substituted in their first edition of the opera a different version. And it goes like this, and this is what we print as our principal text. Bella figlia dell'amore, schiavo son di pezzi tuoi, con un detto sol tu puoi, lei miei peni son consola. That's what you've heard again and again, and it is, of course, what's in the very first edition of the score published by Ricordi. Of course, if we follow this version, we lose the clear presence of the rhyme, but we don't have to listen to poi, an impossible word division. Likewise, in La Forza del Destino, Verdi's autograph, which is from 1862, shows us the melody from the cavallet in Act 1, the following phrase. With that leap. Now that was changed by, in the Ricordi first edition of the score to the following. That's what you've always heard. I have often thought that Ricordi would not have made that change without Verdi's approval, and that probably one can easily imagine them, Verdi sitting with Giulio Ricordi at a rehearsal saying, "You can't hear that lower note, take it up an octave," and his editor did just that. What can scholars say to opera houses to make them pay attention to our work? Not much, I fear. Only when there are performers who care, such as John Mauceri, whom I intend to, who is here with us today and who pays very close attention to Verdi's markings, particularly for the metronome, do we have a chance to break bad habits. I have told more than once the story of a particularly egregious tradition that singers have in Rigoletto. I am not, unlike Muti, implacably opposed to all singer traditions, especially to high notes that do not really change the nature of the score. So I won't, on the very fact they don't sing what Verdi wrote, refuse the singer's tradition of singing a high D flat at the end of the duet for Gila and the Duke in the first act of the opera, nor do I object to Rigoletto singing his Alonda going up to the dominant on lone rather than staying on the third degree as Verdi wrote the passage. He does, according to the Verdi score, Alonda, Alonda, but everybody sings Alonda, Alonda, and then you get the off stage, you hear the Duke singing La Donne Mobile, so he's still alive, okay? But I object enormously to the tradition of going up just before Si Vendetta Tremenda Vendetta in the duet between Gilda and her father at the end of Act 2 of the opera. I object to it because it turns a C natural, the fifth degree of F minor, into a dominant tone that connects the tempo di mezzo to the A flat major key of the cabaletta. Verdi, it seems to me, has so carefully planned this to have the note not function as a dominant that the change seems to me particularly hateful, since it assures us that the sections are connected together, when Verdi apparently wanted a break between them, and yet singer upon singer will sing that E flat because baritones think it's a good note for them, and they care little for Verdi's score. If the public likes the high notes, that's enough for them. So I can accept Violetta's high E flat as a dominant in Sempre Libera, and the high C and D quella pira, as long as the singers don't tell me that they cannot sing the rest of the part as Verdi wrote it, because they have to save their strength for that interpolated sound. Give me a Violetta who can sing all of Verdi's music and the E flat, or all of Manrico's part as Verdi conceived it. As Verdi conceived it, it never goes above the B flat. In fact, in the Act 1 trio, this B flat is an alternative, and Verdi does not really use it, and sing the high C at the end of Di Quella Pira, and I can accept the notes, but don't sacrifice Verdi's music to these high notes. Indeed, as Verdi conceived the part of Manrico, as I said just before, it never goes above the B flat. In fact, in the Act 1 trio, Verdi does not really use even this B flat. Manrico and Leonora sing in unison, except for this note, which when Manrico sings a lower G, not a B flat. It is the only note in the melody they do not sing together. You know this passage. This is the one that goes as follows. She goes to the B flat here, but Verdi writes D flat and B flat. object to the high notes as long as they don't change the nature of the piece. Recently in Chicago, we had a performance of Verdi's Giovanna d'Arco. We have published a good critical edition of the opera, edited by Alberto Rizzuti, and it incorporates the original Verdian words, not those of the censor, who objected to the treatment of Maria as a possible figure fighting for the French. In this case, though, through Joan, or metaphorically, for the Risorgimento. And so, as Francesco Izzo showed in a brilliant article in Jams, they insisted on changing many of the words of the opera. I found particularly objectionable the changes the censors introduced at the end of Act 3, where the father Giacomo denounces his daughter for witchcraft. And in the words of the censors, he says, "In nome del Dio vindice non sacrilega sei tu." Then he asks the question twice again, substituting per l'alma dei parenti and per l'alma di tua madre non sacrilega sei tu. Now, I don't even know for certain that the word sacrilega was in Verdi's vocabulary, but these are certainly not the words he sent to music. Indeed, these words, which have been kept in the old Ricordi edition, are in a foreign hand in Verdi's autograph. He actually had Giacomo say, "In nome della Francia, pura e vergine sei tu." Then, "In nome della fede," and finally, to clinch matters unequivocally, "In nome di Maria," to which the poor girl does not respond because although she is still a virgin, she is no longer pure, since she has clearly given way to her feelings for King Carlo. But the censors didn't want to think of Maria as an important force, so they refused these references to her virginity and purity, which Giovanna had sworn to obey earlier in the opera. The result was a finale to Act 3 that was weak indeed in comparison to what Verdi had written. Now, the stage director in Chicago was the culprit. He had decided to stage the entire opera as a commentary on any kind of intolerance and fanaticism, and wanted to avoid, for that reason, I hope you can hear me, because I know the mic has gone out. Okay. As a commentary on any kind of intolerance and fanaticism, and wanted to avoid, for that reason, comments addressed to Maria directly or related to her, hence to Catholicism. And so we get the earlier text. The conductor backed him in this, but had at least studied the new score and incorporated changes in the articulation and pitches. The audience did not know the difference, of course, but the music was well received, even when the staging left much to be desired. I complained about this afterwards to the director of the Chicago Opera Theater, Andreas Mitterschek, who had little to say in defense of his stage director, except that he allowed him to do as he wanted. I am convinced he was not unhappy at the stage director's choices, since they meant the COT did not have to rent parts from Ricordi's American representative. But he clearly was unhappy about the audience reaction and the statements by critics, which had little patience for the directorial choices. Still, what can we as scholars do to change this situation? In some European countries, I think particularly of Germany and Italy, in which there is public recognition of the problems that can be caused by using inferior scores, there is legislation that protects the works of scholars and editors that back them. But one worries that at a moment in which government support of the arts is under great pressure, even this protection will soon be abandoned. I continue my work, but I can't say that I'm optimistic about the future. I had a run-in with the Metropolitan Opera of New York a few years ago. They clearly believed in their habit of asking important stage directors to stage their operas, even if those stage directors do not know music at all. So they performed Rossini's Le Cantori using a perfectly foul edition of the work, although we were ready with a new edition to be performed in Zurich more than a month before the Met production hit the stage. It has since gone on to performances in Vienna, Paris, and this year will be performed in Lyon and La Scala of Milan. This is not an opera for which we have an autographed manuscript, but we do have the original performance materials from the opera in Paris, and this has stood Damien Collat in very good stead in preparing the new edition, which differs substantially from the old score. To take two examples, the finale of the first act in the old edition is for 7 solo voices, whereas the new score has 13 solo voices. And the finale of the second act is almost twice as long in the new score as it was in the old. People have long complained of how short this finale had seemed to be. Damn student it was, because of course it didn't have the music that Rossini had wrote. Yet, because their stage director could not read music, the Met wanted our edition a full year before the performances. We could not make that deadline. It was more important to them to have a certain stage director than it was to get an accurate rendition of Rossini's opera. I can point out the stupidity of allowing the stage directors to bring Verdi's Un ballo in maschera back to Sweden while using text worked out for Boston, but apparently does little good. And so the Met still has the King of Sweden send Ankerstrom and Amelia across the wide ocean that separates Sweden from Finland. And Ulrica is still del infame sangue dei negri, or rather in America, where Gitani are basically unknown, del infame sangue dei Gitani, even if negri were basically unknown in Sweden in the 18th century, and Verdi originally wrote simply Ulrica la Sibilla. Andreas Giger, who is preparing our new edition of the opera, is intending to include Verdi's Swedish text as well as the Boston text so that opera houses can make intelligent decisions as to how to prepare the score. He will talk to us about that later today. And in his famous duet with Amelia of Act 2, the king says that he's prepared to give up Il mio nome e la corona per un detto, rather than la mia vita, l'universo per un detto. Just as he says at the end of the first scene of the opera, sa fratelli al suo popolo il re, a phrase that was known in Italy at the time the opera was first meant to be performed in Naples in 1857, rather than mai la vita più cara non è, a phrase that means essentially nothing. I don't mean to cast aspersions on that version for Boston, which Verdi worked out carefully, just as he worked out carefully Rigoletto from Mantua, rather than the Paris of Francois Ier, only that it makes no sense to use the text for Boston when a stage director wants to transpose the action to Sweden. The other day we had somebody say that we should ask Luc Bondy what he had in mind with something. I tried to do that on the occasion of the Met's performance of Fairtile Destino this year, on the request, the explicit request of the stage director, who was, what's his name?
Alden.
David Alden.
Yes,
David
right,
Alden.
yeah.
And I wrote to Fabio Luisi, who of course didn't bother responding to me about it, needless to say. I could go on and on about things like this, but I think I've said enough. It's time for my colleagues here on the panel to speak. Thank you very much.
To accommodate. Does anybody want to help you? Yeah. What do you want? We just want to unstack his chairs. Philip, will you join us?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Thank you. Wherever you but I don't mind certainly. I don't know when it's happening.
We don't really need it. They seem not to.
Mine went out over there, I know. But I mean, we can talk about it.
Yes. Well, in response to that fabulous paper, we have several people from different sides of the aisle, as we would say. On the far end here is Linda Fairtile, who many of us know, of course. She's been instrumental in helping put this together, this wonderful conference. She's the head of the Parsons Music Library at the University of Richmond, where she also teaches in the music department. She earned her PhD here at NYU, where she served as archivist for the American Institute for VERDI'S Studies. She's the author of Giacomo Puccini, A Guide to Research. Her articles have appeared in 19th Century Music, Cambridge Opera Journal, Studi Pucciniani, and MCA Notes. She's on the editorial board of the Ricordi's critical edition of the operas of Puccini, for which she is editing Edgar in both the 4-act and 3-act versions. Since 2007, Linda has been a co-director of the American Institute for Verdi's Studies. And immediately to my left, Maestro John Mauceri, who is a musicologist. This conductor is our friend. He has conducted, he conducts whatever possible from critical editions, and he's given the premieres, the American premiere of the critical edition of Ballo in Pittsburgh and of Rigoletto at the English National Opera in London. He gave a premiere of that critical edition. He's a dedicated Verdian. He just appeared on All Things Considered, giving an interview concerned with the Verdi bicentenary. And he attended Yale and also taught there for many years. He's been the music director of 4 opera companies: Scottish Opera, Washington Opera, the Teatro Regio in Torino, and the Pittsburgh Opera, and has just conducted everywhere, opera stages all across the world: the Royal Opera, Covent Garden, La Scala, the Met, Chicago, Deutsche Opera Berlin, San Francisco. Welcome, John Mauceri, Linda Fairtile. I know you have a lot to say, Maestro.
Well, first of all, let me say it's an honor to be here. Of course, that almost goes without saying. And Philip has been my partner in just being able to call him up or to have dinner at his house and just have questions answered has been an incredible source of support for a world in which there is otherwise very little support, as Philip was speaking. And I would also say, Martin Chusett, where are you, Martin? Oh, Martin, it's so good to see you. Martin, he deserves a big hand for that. In fact, I met Martin because his son attended Yale and was principal over the Yale Symphony back in those days, and he was telling me about his dad, and that's how that all happened. Let me just say a couple of things here about some of the issues that Philip brought up. Indeed, when I first conducted the first time Rigoletto, which was with the great benefit of having Martin score, I called him up and I said, look, it really does look a lot like the Rigoletto I've heard in my life, but the most bizarre thing were the tempo indications. And Martin, in his kind and wise way, said, why don't you just try them, see if they work, because they're rather consistent. So what I did that day, and this is about 25 years ago, in the 80s, I guess, sometime longer than that, and I just wrote down the numbers because I found them to be unusual, because Questa Quella was slower than I've ever heard it before. Certain other things were faster. I noted, and I just wrote, in those days I had a Filofax, if some of you are old enough to remember what they are, and I actually just wrote the numbers, because part of my training at Yale as a composer was, in the serial 12-tone time, was just to look at numbers. And I found the numbers to be really quite extraordinary because they seemed to be structural. Certain numbers existed repeatedly, others were completely gone. And by the numbers, I mean the metronome numbers. So what I found out by writing it down, and I looked it up again today, was that 66 was the speed of that opera. It is the speed of the prelude. It is the specific speed of the second scene with Spara Fucile. Act 1 ends with a coda at 100, which had never been used in the entire first act. Act 2 began at 100, which was an interesting thing, and then went to 66. And then in Act 3, the prelude began in 66, Bella Figlia dell'Amore was 66, and Lassù in Ciel was at 66. And I started to think, well, wait a minute, so if da 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 is the same speed as Bella Figlia dell'Amore, but most shocking was Lassù in cielo vicino. And I realized, of course, that suddenly made sense because when you do it in eighth notes, you get Lassù in cielo vicino. So I went to London for a revival of Jonathan Miller's production of Rigoletto in English, and the entire cast had already sung this opera. And so I went with my pocket metronome, and I spent a lot of time saying things like, gee, that's really great, but do you know what Verdi wrote? It's kind of odd. Here's the tempo. And suddenly Questa Quella became dun 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 Questa Quella, as was dun 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 Questa Quella, which is a completely different thing. And every one of the singers said, oh, well, that's easy to sing. Oh, let's try that. Okay. So I literally had to do each unusual, non-international tempo, from my recording tempo, to mention what Philip said. And we performed that opera according to the temporal indications that Verdi had written down. Now, what was so interesting about that was that at every moment the singer said it was easier to sing. And because it was causing quite a stir in London, I wrote a little program note to explain what we were doing. Now, it was a very, very big success. It was not my success, it was actually Verdi's success. But I'll guess what was most disconcerting about this so-called success. By the way, I opened my score this morning to find that every singer had given me a postcard with a picture of a metronome on it. And I still say that, right? Is that the next year the production came back, and whoever the conductor was returned to what the critics said pre-Maucerian tempos, which is a pretty funny way to say it, went back to the recordings. In Macerata, where I also attempted the same thing, we got a lot of that, much of it done. They obviously used old material. I'm working on trying to get it to be the right speed. And it was a success for sure, except that the critic of the local paper wrote, it said, Rigoletto al Seristerio, ma dove era Verdi? Because it didn't sound like his or her recordings, which is part of the deal. Now, in the larger issue of the structural implications of Verdi's use of metronomes, and I don't want to just focus on that right now, but I would say that we would never pick and choose what parts of text we would use. In other words, to throw out the idea of the tempo indications is throwing out one of the basic elements of music, which is its speed. And the telling of a story over a long period of time, this becomes quite significant. And it's not that a tempo is fixed from the beginning and doesn't have all kinds of variations in between. But changing a tempo by as much as 2 degrees changes its meaning and the way we feel about it in the most amazing way. And this is something that Verdi knew. And if Verdi was not present for the premiere of this opera, he would write a letter, and we have a number of them saying, how were the tempi? I've never heard of a composer who wrote that as a basic request. You know, Wagner stopped writing metronome marks very early in his writing because he said that whenever he hears a bad performance of an overture, say, of Meistersinger, he would go back to the conductor and say, I'm sorry, we'll do Fliegende Holle, because this is relevant. Fliegende Holle or Tannhäuser, he said, well, that was not right. But Maestro, the conductor, would inevitably say, I followed your metronome marks. To which Wagner wrote, which proves that they're not relevant. If you don't understand the spirit of my music, a metronome mark is not going to help you. So in a certain way, Wagner was more what we would say Italian, to be racist, since I'm Sicilian, I can say that. And Verdi was more German in the sense of the structure, because that really is part of how he constructed his operas. There seem to be, in my mind, and all of you who are musicologists out there, I hope you'll follow up on this and either tell me that I'm crazy, or maybe it will open a door to something rather interesting. The use of the structures according to the numbers, which he writes, seems to be so crucial. We just did, my assistant Thiago Giverio, who's in the back there, we just did a complete 5-act, complete performance of Vêpres Sicilienne in Bilbao, Spain. First time in the history of Spain that an opera by Verdi was performed in French. But using the best edition that we have now, which is a good edition, and actually observing, and going to the Institute at NYU, which is a treasure, and thank you, Francesco, for opening the doors to us. Here's what we learned. You know, as a kid, it was generally considered that Vêpres was a false step by Verdi. You know, they wrote, always you were writing, whether it was Julian Button or Verdi, that Verdi, it's a constant improvement. You know, it's like he got the Improvement Award, like the year that Elizabeth Taylor got the Academy Award, it was considered an Improvement Award. You know, it's always this denigration of Verdi because he was Italian. And just taking him seriously has been one of the great achievements of the Verdi edition, and Philip and all the people here in Chicago who have made it serious business. So here's what we found out with Vêpres. Vêpres is indeed, okay, a long opera. It's in 5 acts. Those 5 acts, if you observe the metronome marks, and here's what I had to do, because even to imagine the way the music would sound, because there is no recording that does this, there is one recording in sort of French, in pseudo-French for the BBC, and because I have a program in my computer, I can actually take the different elements and change the tempos without changing the pitch, okay? So we could actually hear and imagine, before we even got to Bilbao, what this opera might, what would the cumulative effect of the opera be? Well, I can tell you, of course, that at every moment something is surprising and new and recreated. But here's the point. If you do that opera with 2 intervals, Act 1 and Act 2 together, Act 3 as the center of the arch, because Verdi was one of the great classical structures, and Act 4 and 5 together, here's the story. I wrote this down. Act 1 and 2 together are 1 hour and 5 minutes. Act 3, 1 hour and 4 minutes. Act 4 and 5, 1 hour and 4 minutes. Now, within the context, therefore, of this structure comes the ballet, which is a half-hour long, which is the actual epicenter of the structure. It hits right in the middle. You know, this kind of thing is not an accident from Verdi. And that opera, which was considered to be old-fashioned, and you know, it's an old libretto by Scribe, and you know, Verdi did the best he could. This is an opera about something very important, because the opera begins, as you know, with da-da-dum. Now, it does not begin with da-da-da. Now, the first time you listen to a recording by one of my very famous colleagues, plays the overture, goes da-da-da. It's followed by a quarter note, not an eighth note. It begins, it goes da-da-da, ba-ba-ba. And you don't know what that means, but that third note is a quarter. Later, it's an eighth, and later, it's a half note. Verdi was not like sloppy about this, because he actually wrote the note and wrote the rest after it. It didn't just like dash it off. But here's the point of that da-da-da. We hear it at the beginning of the overture. We go through this whole overture, and all the themes come from the opera. We later, in the first act, we hear da-da-dum, when the soprano says, dans vos mains. The power of government is in your hands. And right now, by the way, all of you American citizens out there might want to do something about that. Now, here's the thing. When you do the opera in Italian, in vostro man is a completely different thing. It doesn't mean anything unless you start the overture with da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, in vostro man. And the last time it's said, she says, dans vos mains, and then he writes, spoken. And she says, in your hands. And then she starts and really sings something. Now, this is an opera about something. And also, it's an amazing opera about a father who is a tyrant and his illegitimate son, who's the hero, who finds out that his dad is, in fact, the man he hates, and whose mother, who's dead, was probably raped in that war. Now, I can think of only Verdi would put such a story on the stage about the power of the people to actually take responsibility for the government, and also the complicated relationship between a father and a son as a product of a rape in a war. Now, I can think of there are probably, I dare say, a lot of people my age in Europe who are German but are probably thinking that maybe Daddy was a Russian because of what was going on in 1945 as the troops were moving westward toward Berlin, and the general in charge of all of the marauding and liberating Russians said to all of those soldiers, take whatever you want. So Vetpa turns out to be an incredibly interesting and impressive opera, and cutting it up is, you know, up to some people, but the fact is that it's completely structurally sound. Now, let me just say a couple of things, because unfortunately, as you're right, I would say too much. And anyway, but so I believe that Verdi, among other things, looked for a kind of epigram. Unlike Wagner and the so-called leitmotif technique, he looked at a way of how to write these operas. How do you get from bar one to the last bar? And I believe he somehow thought, what is this story about? In the case of Rigoletto, it's an inexorable funeral march. What does 66 mean? If you just have a metronome and you play 66 beats to a minute, it is the speed of walking toward death. In the case of La Traviata, it is a 6-note figure that starts piano and goes to pianissimo and descends. It goes ba da 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 da, you know that. But it's frequently played da 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 da, which is the exact opposite of what Verdi wrote. It's not a pathetic upbeat to a downbeat, but it is a diminuendo al niente. So, in point of fact, pari giocare. Oh, it happens all the time in that opera. It becomes, in that epigram, it becomes the way he can write the opera. So that's why in the middle of the first scene of Act 2, which is the most brilliant act in La Traviata, the actual epicenter of the symmetrical libretto, which begins with an aria and a cabaletta and ends with an aria and a cabaletta and has 2 duets in between, is when Violetta and Alfredo meet. For less than 2 minutes, they meet, the 2 people who we care about most. And what does she say in the middle of the middle of the middle? The actual point in the arc. Amami Alfredo, amami quanti io t'amo. It's an equation. I love you equals you love me. Now, she sings this same line. Amami Alfredo. She has to go, amami Alfredo. She goes, amami Alfredo. And what happens here? Silence, a roll of the timpani. And one of my colleagues here adds a crescendo in the timpani in a recording that he made. So it goes, amami Alfredo. Well, it would be great if Mascagni had written that. It would be great if you're prepared for this to be a Verismo opera. But what happens is, amami Alfredo, and he doesn't say, I love you. He just can't, because he's not so sure. And again, either this conductor and other conductors think that they know better than Verdi, or that this is the way to sell it, as it were, or they're unaware that the structure of this opera is totally classical. Yes, it's wildly passionate within that structure, but that's the respect. We would never produce Hamlet and have an actor say, to be or not to be, that's the rub. Now, that is a version that was published in a spurious edition of Shakespeare. Now, if the guy who's playing your Hamlet in your production, or the director, says, I like that that's the rub, that's closer to what the public's going to mean, can you imagine the effect that would have if you gave Shakespeare, who was constantly rewriting and constantly, that respect? And so I'm hoping that in the 3rd century, which is the point of all of this, that we continue to understand that he was an unequal genius. The operas will last forever as long as there are people who care about telling important stories with music, because that's what we humans do. And the work of Philip and all of you is so critically important. And yes, the Metropolitan Opera does not have the critical editions. They do not have them for Wagner. And the argument is, we have an unbroken tradition here of people who perform from the beginning, and so we do not need
it doesn't quite work, because musicologists will tell us what we already have seen over the years. This is a pity. And until, of course, all the really great conductors and the great singers, of which you've mentioned a number, and because of recordings now being much more diffuse, hopefully we'll get this right in the next century. But there's one thing that's for sure, at least we can always go back to the work under your direction, Philip, so that we know what we're doing and support the idea of a critical text from which we can interpret and perform. Thanks.
Linda, would you care to comment?
Well, I don't have either the editorial experience of Professor Gossett or the performing experience of Maestro Mauceri, so I'm feeling a little bit in awe of everyone who's up here. But the ideas expressed in Professor Gossett's talk have resonated with me pretty much since I started as Verdi archivist about 25 years ago, and they've become more concrete as I've worked on my edition of Puccini's Edgar, which I call it Edgar when I'm on stage, but if I get too comfortable, I may call it Edgar. Just keep in mind, they're the same thing. And believe it or not, also in my work as a music librarian, a particular point of Professor Gossett's talk, which I'll reference in a minute, I just wanted to talk about three concerns that really came across to me in your talk. And the first one, of course, is the question of why people don't use these editions as much as they should. We know that they are superior texts, that they carry information that just is not available in the editions that most theaters use. And this is the part that resonates with my librarian experiences, because we find that in universities we subscribe to lots of different materials, databases in all subject areas, and wonderful peer-reviewed articles and other resources, and our students go to Google and Wikipedia. So this is pretty much the same thing. The material is there, and in our case, it's free. We pay for it, but the students can access it for free. And why don't they? Why don't they use these things that we know, that we understand, are better for them? And the way we approach this, or at least the way my colleagues at the University of Richmond approach it, is to try to think of why students are doing this, listening to their concerns, because after all, people don't spend money on something or spend time on something unless they know it's going to help them. If you're selling laundry detergent, you have to convince people not to use the stuff in the basement that they've already paid for and that does a pretty good job. You want them to use your product, which is better, and that's kind of a crude way of putting it, but it's the same idea. And I think for us to really kind of embark on an educational mission, even though these editions have been around since I was an undergraduate, I used Rigoletto in my conducting lessons, it goes back that far, to convince people, but to listen to their reasons. Even though we don't agree with the objections that they put up, we can always counter them, but I think we need to be sincere and honest and listen to why they feel that these editions don't serve their purposes. And of course, a lot of it is always financial. I think in particular with theaters, you might get the argument, especially among smaller second-tier theaters, that it's just too expensive, obviously. And they might also say that, well, in your example of using money for gold paint on a set rather than buying or renting an edition that would give you a better result, they might argue that, well, we live in a visual culture and the expectations of our audience would be met more easily and more adequately by showing them a fancy set. They might not know enough about the music to understand that they're getting something better orally or even visually from using a critical edition. So the immediacy of the visual element is something that I think theaters would argue is really what they want to concentrate on. It's not at all what we would agree with necessarily. For singers, I think they might tell you that the time that it takes to unlearn and relearn a part, whether it's a large-scale adjustment or even just smaller things, for singers not like Renee Fleming, the top echelon, but singers who may only perform from this edition once in their career, is it worth it to them to spend all this time and then they go back to singing it in a regular edition again and have to unlearn what they just learned? I can see them maybe using that as an objection, that is one thing that is just not a good return on their investment. For audiences, now I did a sort of a version of these same concepts back in the 2001 conference. In Parma was where I presented. And one of the things I did was I surveyed people who contributed to Opera L, if you're familiar with that. It's a listserv for very dedicated opera fans, people who really know their opera and are really passionate about it. And I asked a number of them, what do you think about critical editions? And the misunderstandings and the misconceptions that they gave me, I'm sure you've all heard them. Number one, that a critical edition tells you exactly how you have to perform, and it doesn't allow for any creativity on the part of the artist. It's too rigid, which we know is not true. It's clearly the opposite. The idea that these editions really don't have all that much different in them, but they were created only so that out of copyright material could be put back in copyright, the publishers could make more money, another falsehood, obviously. But this is what people who know about opera are saying. So you can imagine what people who really don't understand, who are new to opera, who are only go occasionally, would be totally confused. But what is the purpose of this? And why are they bothering to do this edition versus another one? They just don't understand it all. So there's a real educational gap there. And I think also, crucially, we've lost one of our partners, one of our allies in this mission. That is the music critic. When I worked on this research in 2001, one of the things I did was I looked at reviews of Verdi operas performed with critical editions. And in many cases, the critics said, yes, this edition was used. Here are some of the changes, some of the points that make this different from what people are used to hearing. Here are the ways, believe it or not, that it helped, that it improved. That there were cleaner textures, the articulations were more exact. Even when I didn't find a specific identification that the edition was used, there was still some circumstantial evidence that seemed to indicate that the edition somehow made a difference. It would be very difficult to find that level of criticism today, simply because these critics are disappearing. If operas are reviewed in newspapers, they're reviewed by generalists who don't have that depth of understanding, and it's just not there. And so the audience is not getting educated in that regard, and that's a real problem, I think. So that's, I think, where we need to really kind of step into that breach and educate all of these different constituencies and make them understand why these editions really are the best that are out there and you should be using them. One place where I think these sorts of editions really can get recognition in a more accessible way is the idea of alternate versions of operas, entire versions, of revisions versus original versions and things like that. I can remember some of my favorite performances at the dear departed New York City Opera were the original version of Madame Butterfly and the version of Turandot with Alfano's original full-length ending. And those were just revelations to me. Now, I'm probably not the typical opera goer. I'm deliberately looking for things like that. But I remember that those performances sold very well to a public that really was curious and wanted to hear these alternate versions. And these were not critical editions. There was no Puccini critical edition at that time, but they were editions prepared according to manuscript sources prepared recently. So in a sense, they were replicating that concept. And I think that's really a good opportunity, even for the casual opera goer, to see something different, to see something interesting, if that aspect of a critical edition is employed. The only thing is you need to be careful how you advertise, because I remember that Madame Butterfly was advertised as Puccini's preferred version of the opera, which of course may be true, sort of. There's correspondence that may suggest he preferred some parts of the original version, but it's very easy to kind of cut corners and for the sake of advertising, to say something that's not quite right. Another point that Professor Gossett raised, and which I found also to be very relevant, is the idea that if a theater does decide to use a critical edition, there can often be a disconnect between the commitment of the conductors and the musical staff versus the directorial staff to this edition. I guess that's sort of an understatement, but the idea that as much as the performers, the singers and the conductors may try to adhere to different ideas expressed in the score, the director has his or her own interpretation. And of course we know that there are authoritative sources for the way operas were performed originally. That would be the Disposizioni Sceniche and the Livret di Mise en Scène, which I don't think anyone in this room would advocate using on a modern stage. But I think it's not asking too much to hope that the directors would adhere at least to the printed instructions in the score. Oh. And that doesn't always happen. I can give an example of Puccini. This happens to Puccini too. In the first performance of my edition of Edgar in 2008, this was billed as the 1889 version, which hasn't been heard in over 100 years, and they were very emphatic about that. However, the director, who I will not name, decided that he wanted to set it in 19th century Italy, even though it takes place in Flanders in 1302. So a bit of a disconnect there. And not only that, but he decided that Jose Cura, who sang the lead the title role, would be made up to look like Puccini. So we had this very curious spectacle in the second act when Edgar sort of rallies the Flemish peasants to overthrow the French occupying army. And there's a big patriotic chorus, and they talk about the Fiamminghi and Filippo di Francia. And what you see is a group of Italian bourgeois gentlemen led by an ersatz Puccini with a big tricolore following them off stage. And so, I don't know if
We all
any
know
amount
how
of,
political Puccini
yes,
was.
yes.
No.
I don't know if any amount of education can remedy that, but that's definitely a situation where you need to get everybody on board with the edition, not just one half of the production team. So anyway, those are just some thoughts I had about this presentation.
I just wanted to briefly say, just speaking from the standpoint of somebody who has to mediate this kind of situation very frequently, I will tell you the number one obstacle from where I sit is dollar signs. This is what every time I've tried to use a critical edition and it's been shot down by the company that I worked for, it's been about money. It's just, Philip gave some examples of that, and that is like, that's the brick wall that you hit, if you have a maestro who has, enough clout, they can make it happen. But it's a real, what with the economy these days, and also, as you were saying, Philip, the choices that opera companies make on what aspects of a production to spend money on, and Linda, you very wisely observed that it has to do with audience perception, that the gold paint is something that the audience will notice more than a critical edition. So that's that's my experience. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. No, thank you for a wonderful presentation and panel. I just wanted to add, there's one other piece that to me is hard to understand. So in the case of the CSO and doing the critical edition of Macbeth like a week ago, renting the parts from Moose and Hawks, so doing everything and not saying it anywhere that they're doing that. So where does that come from? I mean, it seems like it's against their own interest, right? So they consulted with me. I'm the managing editor for the edition at the Chicago Press. So they did all the right things, but then nowhere in the posters, in the program notes, they don't advertise it. So I'm saying,
Good point.
you encounter that often. So because if Muti is supposed to be the good conductor, he has the cloud, he has everything. The CSO has everything. But they don't have the clothes, but not telling anybody that that's what they're doing. No?
I can tell you that they did, in fact.
And on the other hand, the same week, as you said, that Giovanna D'Arco done at the Chicago Opera Theater, trumpeting critical edition everywhere, which was not true. I mean, who is going to call these companies out on this? But to me, it's less understandable the case of the CSO, because to me, it's like, as we say in Italian, si dà la zappa sul piede. So I mean, they do something, but they don't tell us. So I mean, even if we want to say bravi, but we cannot because we don't know.
And I always thought that that's a missed marketing opportunity, and that's one of the ways that I've always tried to sell critical editions to the companies I was working with, is by saying you can advertise that this,
Wasn't it a requirement? I always thought it was a requirement when you rented the parts that you had to put that in.
Officially it is, but they don't do it. But I can tell you that Phil Huscher, in his notes, does in fact mention it.
I couldn't find it really.
It does mention it towards the end of his note.
I thought that tiny, come on, but I mean, yeah,
But one way of,
it does,
yeah.
of course, acknowledging, but what's the point? I mean, just say it, based on, I mean, we are using it,
Sure.
right? We're spending the money, this is a critical edition, so maybe then it's a problem of the critical edition itself that we don't have, we are not sexy enough. I mean, do we have to be,
But I think that again, marketing departments can help to make it sexy just by, by putting out there, oh, this is the premiere of a critical, and then everybody thinks, oh, this is.
Well,
must
also,
be a
the
big
major
deal.
houses have to take responsibility
Yes.
here. If the Metropolitan Opera does Carmen with the spurious recitatives written by another composer, and that's the new production, and no one even calls them out to say, what are you doing here? And so it's a relationship. The major companies have to take this responsibility to lead the rest of the world, and the critics have got to have that same responsibility. And I would say to you that in part of this is the teaching of those people who become critics, the teaching of those singers, that it's their responsibility to learn the correct notes, so to learn not to be or not to be I, that's the rub, but to actually learn the notes, so that when they're in another situation where a conductor isn't on that they supersede it. And as far as the power of directors, that has to be the opera company. If the opera company does not support the conductor over the stage director, then you're dead. You're simply dead. I mean, I had a situation where I had someone tell me exactly how many notes on the glass harmonica I was allowed to use in Lucia di Lammermoor because the public wanted the flute. I went, what are you talking? I mean, literally going through note by note. And it was like being in a Kafka short story. Like, are you kidding? This is the right thing to do, and you're telling me to do the wrong thing to do. So it is the issue. The conductor presumably should be the last word, or the dramaturg, to actually make sure that the text is correct, and then go.
But so often, I mean, as you can attest, as all of us can attest, you know, it depends what house you're working in. In many houses, what the director says goes. Doesn't matter what. Yeah. You know, we've all been through that, and that's something. In some places, it's not a problem, and in a lot of places these days, it really is.
I was asked to conduct a revival of Francesca's production of Porgy and Bess at the Washington National Opera. Now, some of you might know that I put together the original version of Porgy and Bess as it was first performed, and the only edition of Porgy and Bess in which the composer actually signed off on it. Now, he died a year and a half later, so yeah, there's a lot more music, but we have no idea how much he would have done this or that. So the one thing we do actually know, we have the set of parts, we even have recordings of Gershwin conducting it, we have little ticks from the trombone player as to when it was conducted in 4, when it was in 2, when there were railroad tracks. I mean, we have that stuff. It's all sitting at Yale. And I was hired specifically not to do that. Wow. Because this production had predated any of that work, and I was not to insist on what the composer wrote. Now, I had to think, okay, do I do it? Do I not do it? I want to go back to Washington. So I agreed. Now, mind you, Francesca at a number of points said, gee, I wish I had known that. Gee, I wish I could change that. I wish I had known that. And so that brings us back to the first conductor, when she first did that production, not having the tools or whatever to, in fact, do that. Now, what do you do in a situation? You try to make the best. It's a living piece of music theater, so you do the best. So I would say that what we did was maybe better or closer to George Gershwin, but again, it was performed in 2 acts. It's a 3-act opera. What do you do when someone takes an opera and slashes it in half, and the whole structure of it, and that's how everyone performs Porgy and Bess. So, question from a lady in the balcony.
Yes.
One thing that I'm not sure was mentioned, and it seems to me is the job of the publisher to take the old edition off the market once they are selling the new.
It's public domain, though. See, it's public domain. You don't control.
The trouble is that I know this, because I've said this to Ricordi in the same way, but their attitude is that as long as Calmus is selling it, they have to continue selling it. Otherwise, people will just buy the Calmus. They won't buy their scores. And there's nothing you can do about it. I've tried very hard to get Ricordi to come along with this, but they won't.
And also, when opera companies have their own scores and sets of parts, and they just don't want to spend the money.
I think it's important to understand that, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you do the critical edition, part of the grand rights goes to the publisher. You don't just rent it. You're actually paying a percentage of the gross.
Not in America. I don't think it's in America that works.
But you understand, so this is a financial issue, a big financial issue. And I know that when the first time I conducted Barbara Seville in Wales, the Zeta edition was out. They told me they had those parts. They did not have those parts. I spent weeks correcting articulations. And ironically, unless the companies support this, again, it's a collaboration. We can all talk here in this lovely little room, but we really need to get the importance of this out into the schools. The singers learn how to do it. The directors respect it. You hire a choreographer for Aida. He's not saying I need it, or she's not saying I need another 32 bars here, right?
I've had directors like that.
Well, you're hiring people to actually do the text. And by the way, as far as the original
direction that Verdi might have written, there was a hugely successful Otello in Wales, which followed Verdi's stage directions, but the scenery was different, and it was a revelation. The critics said, "Wow, this is so really good." Well, oh, duh. I mean, the composer, was the director. He envisioned the whole thing in his mind, and I do think that the publication of that information is really valuable for a kind of director. He's the director you want to hire. He or she is the director you actually want to hire, who starts from the text, believes in it, and then goes forward. Sure. When we did Vepa, what was significant is that production did not take place in the 13th century in Sicily. It took place in Sicily at the time that the mafia had blown up cars and killed fellow Sicilians. And this was actually a brilliant move. There was nothing about it that was odd, except that when the scene opened, people gasped because they actually saw a replication of the burned out cars that had happened, that had been seen. And they used video. The ballet, they didn't have the money to actually stage the ballet, so they used the Four Seasons to show political imagery from 4 different corrupt parts of government in the world. And I mean, it was an extraordinary solution to allowing all of Verdi's music to be played without the cost of having a ballet company come in. So it is always possible to solve these things if your point of view is that the fidelity to the musical text whenever possible.
Yes. I suppose I have a question for Professor Gossett.
Sure.
You licensed the existence of interpolated high notes, which you mentioned, as licit departures from a critical edition. Well, can you say whether generally or more specifically other licenses in the old sense you would permit, whether categorically
Sure.
or specific instances?
I tried to say before that what we're trying to do is produce the best possible written text of an opera, but we do understand that performers have to have certain rights because they are the ones who go before the public.
You said that very eloquently, and I myself believe that it is singers who realize the music.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
But my
Are
question
there
is, other than the high notes, do other departures?
I mean, in the case of La Traviata, for example, the fact of making those cuts in the first act, Addio al passato, A forse lui, doesn't seem to me a terrible error, although I do recognize the argument that this is a thing that provides a sense of who Violetta is and that she is French. But I find that Verdi's use of the 2 strophes there really doesn't do very much for us, unlike the third act aria, where I think his 2 strophes are very different. You also get the situation in the cabaletta of Germant's aria, of Giorgio Germant's aria in at the end of the first scene of the second act. That's another place where it is typical to cut the entire cabaletta, not just part of it. Not just, you see in many cases, Verdi was clear that he was following certain procedures because they were typical of Italian opera at the time, so that we get twice through a lot of cabaletta themes. Now, it's one thing when you have an opera in which this doesn't happen very often, but it's another thing if it happens again and again and again. You can understand that an opera company feels that they don't want to repeat these things, and the composer was understood after a while as being willing to make those changes because he did not, in fact, insist upon the cabaletta repeats later on in his career, but he did write them the first time round. I would say that in the case of the example I gave from La Traviata, that in fact, if you look at the 2 versions of that piece, the first version is much more powerful than the second version because Giorgio Germant had a lower voice than we know from the latter version, and so that in fact the first version of that cabaletta is much more powerful than is the second version, that is the one that people generally cut. Should they cut it entirely? Well, I've often thought that that the notion of Alfredo, who gets running off to Paris after his father sings Di Provence il mare del Suol, is a little abrupt. I've never liked that very much, but I can understand why an opera house does it, makes the cut, particularly if they've heard the thing cut again and again. But I do think that the question of cuts is important, as not just a question of high notes. And we do find that there's a whole category of cuts of that kind. Now, if you look at something like Macbeth, you'll find that there are very few places where in the 1865 version you get a simple repetition. And Muti, when he did it with the CSO, did all the repetitions, even when you get not an orchestral and vocal tempo di mezzo transition between the two sections of the cabaletta, and you get the theme again. He did them all, both times, and very successfully. But I could understand perfectly well the decision to make the cut at that point and not to do the repetition.
I was going to say one other thing about this is that if you do that cabaletta at Verdi's tempo, it does not seem to be too much to do it twice. And the idea of Addio del Passato, which is always conducted in 6, no wonder you have to only sing one, because it is a memory waltz. It's not Addio del Passato, it's Addio del Passato, it's Libiamo, the major, the minor, the major, the minor. It's a waltz opera. It's an opera in which the waltz becomes symbolic of the whole movement. So if you get a soprano, I was very happy to have a number of sopranos who were willing to sing Addio del Passato at Verdi's tempo and sing both times through, because the second time where she's talking about having an unmarked grave is terrible, and to cut that is just awful, because as Verdi is spinning this tale in which we realize that the best person in this opera is a whore. She's the only one who matters. She's the saint. So he is ringing out this story so that we leave that theater as better people and not as hypocrites. To cut those things means just to make it I once said, when I was a kid, I thought that La Traviata was a short and boring opera, and I found out that it's a rather long and really interesting opera.
Well, I'm sure this discussion will continue through lunch and all afternoon and probably till we leave town. But for now, I want to thank once again Philip Gossett for his brilliant presentation, and our wonderful panelists Linda Fairtile and John Mauceri.